Well, good evening, everyone. I'll start with saying this right off the bat. I am not a social media expert. I have one Instagram account, and I think I posted something about 10 years ago. I have a Facebook account that I opened because I needed to look something up, and I haven't used it since. So I'll apologize right now if I don't use quite the right phrasing to discuss this and quite the right language, but I think I've done some research and have some information that might be useful for us this evening. So we'll start with an agenda, see what we would like to cover this evening. We'd like to look at four main parts. We'll look at a definition for social media, what it can be used for. We'll look at its effect, and in particular, we're going to look at a subsection of its effect and look at the harm that I believe it's caused. And lastly, we'll look at some biblical advice on this topic of social media. So first of all then, a definition. To be considered really social media, true social media, the media has to have four qualities. And these qualities are that they have user profiles. That is, users who create individual profiles where they can share personal information and interests. There has to be user-generated content. That's the users create and share a variety of content to a broad audience, and that would include text and photos and videos and links. The app or the application has to have networking. The users can connect with other users by following their profiles and becoming friends or joining the same group. And there has to be interactivity. That is, the users interact with each other and with the content that they share. And that might include commenting, sharing, direct messaging, liking, and that sort of thing. So examples of true social media would be in the list there: Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Snapchat, and so on, because they all have those four features. And it's fairly different than pure messaging apps. So iMessage or WhatsApp or Facebook Messenger do not have those four features and are not really considered true social media. And the growth of social media has been insidious, hasn't it? I mean, it started out kind of small and it's grown ever since, and it's really, you would say, practically exploded. And there may be a perception that, well, even for Bible students such as us, that it's all okay. I mean, it's just a new way of communicating for people. It's good for society. And, I think that we need to seriously look at this topic and that perception as we investigate it this evening. Well, what can social media be used for? Well, quite a number of things. Communication, entertainment. You can get your entertainment value from social media. You can gather information. Maybe you like to follow a particular chef who posts good recipes. Maybe you like this one author that the way he comments on, I don't know, classic cars or something, or maybe there's particular books, a book category, and you like following someone who posts about that. You can use it to advertise a business. A business was run out of our house, and 90% of the advertising was done on Instagram. You can learn very quickly what the norm is of a society or a particular group that you follow. You can use it to advertise yourself. That is, you develop your own personal online brand through your social media profile. And we like to look at these last two in particular. So learning the norm, and along with that comes the pressure to conform to that norm, usually. I mean, when we think of conformity, as people, there seems to be this underlying pressure to conform. It's often called peer pressure, isn't it? I mean, people seem to have this built-in bias to avoid standing out as being different. And, normally in a situation, people would have to look around them, socialize in the group, and slowly learn what the norm is, what for that particular group or for society as a whole, how they think, how they behave. We might think of getting a new job, and it might take weeks or months to get to know the norm for everybody in that particular position or that office. It takes time. It takes communication. Or a kid at a new school, and how much time it would take to get to learn what that school society is all about. Well, all of that changes with social media. You can join a particular group and scroll through literally 1,000 pieces of data within 1 hour. That would be roughly one every 3 seconds. And each one is accompanied by a numerical evidence, the number of likes it has, the number of comments that are there, that show whether the post was a success or a failure. And you can learn what a group views as acceptable or good in a matter of hours. And so, we as parents ought to be aware of this. And just have a look at this quote that I came across, that social media platforms are the most efficient conformity engines ever invented. So very useful for anyone that is interested in conforming to society or to a group that they've joined. And the last use that we said, well, it can be used to advertise yourself. So some might say that, this is the real purpose of social media. People can quickly look at your profile and see what you are all about. And more than this, the number of followers that you have indicates just how interesting you are. And many aspire to become really good at social media. And many become so good at social media that they become considered an influencer or a social media celebrity, someone who is exceptionally good at social media. We might say they're famous for being famous. And you can quantify just how famous you are by, again, how many followers you have, the success of every post, that it's quantified, and it's displayed with likes and comments and retweets. And people, as people, we have this sort of, somehow desire to get close to fame and prestige. So they follow that type of person, who they're literally called followers. And the influencers are called the users. Well, there's an interesting quote that I came across regarding influencers, and it seems to back up what many people would say about them, that studies have shown that consuming influencer content directly affects the way teenagers behave. And many teenagers report feeling as though they trust or know social media influencers personally, which makes them more likely to want to copy their behaviors or model the actions that they see. And so consequently, these individuals with large, highly engaged social media followings hold considerable sway in particular industries like beauty or fashion or fitness, whatever their forte is. And so we have something called influencer marketing, where companies will approach the influencer and pay them to advertise their products to their fan base. And this is no small job. You see, I did a quick little search, top 10 influencers, the top 10 paid influencers. The first one listed had earnings over $82 million. Number 10 on the list had a measly $17.5 million in earnings. And so that in itself, when teenagers look at that, it becomes an allurement to some of them who want to have their own thoughts of being famous for being famous and becoming an influencer in their field and making millions. Well, what effect has social media had on society? So we're going to look at this in 4 stages. We're going to just kind of take stock a little bit and look at its development, how social media came about. We're going to have a look at some evidence to see if social media has had an effect on mental health. We're going to look at how it's affected people's use of time. And lastly, how children and adolescents and even adults play. So a bit of groundwork first before we get into the background of the development of social media. And that is to just kind of look at the age groups of people. We know that baby boomers, these are the ages or the years in which these generations were born. So 1946, 1964 is the year of birth for the generation called the baby boomers. Probably read a lot about them. Generation X was the next one, Gen X, 1965 to about 1980. Millennials. So millennials are getting into adulthood, most of them, 1981 to 1996. And then we want to pay some close attention to this next generation, Generation Z, or as it's called, Gen Z. 1997, they were first born until about 2012. And then we keep going on with Generation Alpha, 2013 to present. So today, Gen Z would be roughly 12 to 27 years old. So the oldest member of Gen Z was around 12 years old in about the year 2010, 2009, 2010. The first Gen Zers became 12 years old. In 2015, that would have made them around 18 years old. And we're going to kind of focus on this period between 2010 and 2015. Well, why? Well, when we look at technologies that were embraced in society, we see that technology has always been fairly quickly embraced. So you look at radio, and for the most part, they were in homes within about 10 years. When we look at TV, same thing. Most homes had one, a color TV, within about 10 years of its introduction. 1990s would have seen the rapid increase in dial-up internet and personal computers, and they were in most homes by about 2001. In the 1990s as well, people and teens would have had basic phones that would have been good for communicating directly with family and friends. In other words, one-on-one calling and texting. Mid-2000s, broadband internet, high-speed internet was introduced. The first iPhone came out in 2007. And then social media and smartphones are seen to reach the majority of homes by about 2012 or 13, right in the middle of the time period we want to look at of 2010 to 2015. So on the smartphone, of course, are now millions of apps available, and it very quickly became the home of social media apps and continually urging through the day to check what everyone was saying and doing. No longer just family and friends. And you're not just on social media when you're sitting at the family computer, but you could be online all the time with an internet device in your pocket. The ability to like and retweet came out in 2009. The front-facing camera came out in 2010, increasing the prevalence of posting images of yourself. The selfie was born. And then Facebook acquired Instagram in 2012, boosting its popularity even further. Well, what was the result of all this? And did it produce any changes? Were they good? Were they bad? Inconsequential? Well, to correlate this, let's have a look at some statistics for mental health. Now, we hear a lot about mental health these days. When I was growing up, I don't ever even recall those words being used together as a phrase. Now, it's not to say that it didn't exist. Obviously, it did. And obviously, it was a topic that tended to be avoided. But is the fact that it's discussed more merely due to a desire to recognize its existence? Or in fact, are there more people who struggle with mental health? Well, if we look at this chart here, mental health seemed to be, this is, by the way, a chart that shows college students who reported at least one major depression event within the last year. So you can see it was fairly stable up until about, lo and behold, 2010. And then for some reason, there was an increase, a great increase. And since 2010, as a matter of fact, as much as 150% increase of major depression events within the last year. How about people being diagnosed with various types of mental illnesses, not just self-reporting according to a checklist, but being diagnosed with a mental illness by a doctor? Or how about, in particular, because we'll notice that anxiety is at the top of the list, anxiety. Interesting that this was greatly increased in the younger age groups, closest to Gen Z. Now, just a word about anxiety. You know, anxiety is related to fear, but it's not the same, is it? Because fear is an emotional response to a real or imminent threat, whereas anxiety is an anticipation of a possible future threat. And it seems to be the defining mental illness of young people today. Because, well, when danger lurks, it's healthy to be alert, but when regular, normal events frequently activate our alarm systems, it becomes one of a state of constant distress, and that's anxiety. Well, how about, again, people treated for self-injury? Again, we'll notice that basically from 2000 till 2010, in all these charts, there's basically no decline in teen mental health. And their mental illness was fairly stable in the 2000s. Then in 2010 to 2015, we see this mental illness shoot up for Generation Z. And the millennials in the previous decade don't seem to see that. And it's also reported, not just because most of these data has come from the US, it's not just in the US, it's in other countries as well. Canada, the UK, Australia, Denmark, they all have the same pattern around the same time by age. And so I thought, well, could it be due to the economy or major world events? So you do a little bit of research on that and you see that, well, first of all, there's no past correlation to economic downturns and an increase in mental health illness. And as a matter of fact, between 2010 and 2015, unemployment fell. It was a time of economic prosperity. And as far as world events, well, the ones that I saw, Osama bin Laden's death was in 2011. It's probably viewed by most as not a bad thing. Arab Spring was 2010 to 2012. The Fukushima disaster was in 2011. And the Ebola outbreak of 2014 to 2016. I really didn't seem to find a correlation between those kinds of events creating this kind of statistic. Or could it actually be due to the fact that Gen Z became the first generation to go through puberty in history between the ages or the years 2010 to 2015 with a portal in their pockets that consistently called them away from people physically present to some alternate universe that they thought was exciting, but in fact was addictive and unstable, and what I would say, unsuitable. They were compelled to develop themselves as an online brand, to consume vast quantities of user-generated entertainment and material, to spend far less time talking and touching and making eye contact with family and friends. You know, there's been some research into what can be called sensitive periods. So a sensitive period is one in which it's very easy to learn something or to acquire a skill. And outside of that period of your life, it's rather difficult. So, we're probably familiar with learning a language. Children pick up languages really easy. Around 10 or 12, that ability, we seem to lose it. Psychologists have studied social and cultural learning and figure that between the ages of 9 and 15, it's a sensitive period for this. And they did that by by observing families where the family had to move away for work. Say they moved from Japan to the United States for a few years, and they found a person who was 15 years of age or later goes to the US for a number of years, returns to Japan, and never feels American. A younger person, say 8, goes to the US, returns to Japan by about 12, would easily then relearn and reintegrate into Japanese society and be able to adjust. But someone who goes to the US at around the age of 12 and returns to Japan by about 16 or 17 had difficulty reintegrating. America had shaped their sense of self and feelings and the way they communicated. They felt American. So what happens to an 11-year-old who gets their first smartphone and gets socialized into the culture of Instagram and TikTok and on online video games? Instead of there being a proper sequential introduction of age-appropriate experience that they get with their peers, they're plunged into a whirlpool of adult content and experiences that arrive in no particular order. What gets rewarded? What gets punished? How friendships developed? What's desirable? All of these things are determined by thousands of posts and comments and ratings. I think we can say that Gen Z was the first generation to go through puberty, this sensitive period for cultural learning on a smartphone. Well, what about the use of time? What effect has social media had on the use of time? 2007 ushered in, as we said, the first smartphone. 2008 was the opening of the Apple App Store and also the Google Play Store in 2008. Third-party developers were allowed to develop apps for the smartphone. It started with 500 apps each. In 2013, more than 1 million apps are available on each platform. In 2022, more than 1.6 million apps are available. So what does this mean? It means competition. So these companies have free to use, but advertise-based business models. I mean, who wants to pay $2.99 for an app? I just want to use it for free. And I got to put up with some ads. Okay. So what are they competing for? They're competing for who can hold your attention the longest. And people have always been mesmerized by screens, but when it comes to social media, well, that's now on a whole new level. And is it effective? Well, in the 90s, they say that an average teen spent less than 3 hours per day watching TV. Now, that in itself is just under 20 hours a week. Today, the average screen time for teens is 6 to 8 hours per day. That's 40 to 50 hours per week. And researchers say that a third of all teens say that they're on social media almost constantly. And 45% of them say they use the internet almost constantly. So you might think, how is that possible almost constantly? When they only have a certain amount of leisure time. Well, when we add all the time that they're either using or actively thinking about social media while multitasking in the real world, it suddenly starts to add up. People might be on their devices or may not be on their devices and appear to be doing something in the real world, eating, talking in class, working. But a significant amount of their attention is used monitoring or worrying about events in the virtual world. So for some 16 hours a day, that's 112 hours a week, people are not fully present in whatever's going on around them. They're there, but they're not there. They're forever everywhere else. And I can kind of anecdotally attest to this. Speaking to some colleagues at work who fly with more junior pilots than I do, it's kind of an etiquette, a custom really, for pilots to go on a layover and you meet together and you go out for a nice little dinner of some sort and you say good morning and you go back to work. Well, these pilots now who are flying with first officers from the Gen Z generation, you know what they do, some of them? They'll say to the captain, yeah, no thanks, not going out for dinner. I've got my gaming console with me. I'm going to go to my hotel room and spend the entire layover gaming online. I'll see you at pickup. So that's how Gen Z spends their time, some of them. So many adolescents and adults have really lost the ability to be fully present with people around them. And so in particular, daily life and consciousness and social relationships of a 13-year-old born in 1999, was profoundly different than a 13-year-old with a flip phone in 2007. Well, lastly, we'd like to just look at how adolescents play and what's changed about that. I think we would all agree that play is good for kids, adolescents, and even adults, undertaken for its own sake. Being outdoors with others of mixed ages is particularly healthy. And you know what? It should have for kids some degree of physical risk. You can only learn how not to get hurt in situations where it's possible to get hurt. Because that teaches kids how to look out for themselves, look out for each other, play wrestling, negotiating a seesaw, climbing a tree and building a tree fort or a ramp for your bike, exploring a forest. No coaches, no parents, no direct supervision. Kids need that to learn to read emotions and tolerate bruises and take turns and resolve conflicts. All those things are good for kids. But interestingly, I think we find that playgrounds that used to look like the one on the left today look like the one on the right. And so the thought became that the physical world was becoming dangerous. And in certain ways it was. And there was a shift toward protecting youth and restricting their autonomy in the real world, such that some got no unsupervised outdoor play. And there was also the thought that, they should have a phone. It was a safety device so that if something happened, they could contact their parents, or their parents could contact them, or the parents could even see where they were on their phone. But did parents understand the dangers that were lurking in the devices that they gave their kids and who their kids were in contact with virtually? And so was the result proper protection, perhaps overprotection in the real world, but under protection in the virtual world? You compare traditional playing versus virtual playing, and they're completely opposite. So let's look at some of the harms that social media has caused. And I think that there are 4 of them. So we'll start with social deprivation. You know, people need to have face-to-face interaction, to be in the bodily presence of each other. You know, I did a little search on the health benefits of being together with people. And there were like 10 pages worth, and it kept going, and I just stopped. And after a few articles outlining the benefits of it, there were scores of articles on the benefits of working and socializing and playing and being friends and family and singing and biking and hiking and volunteering, all doing those things together. Now that's contrasted to sitting alone in a room, consuming endless quantities of other people's content, or playing video games with strangers, or posting your own content, waiting for someone to like it. And not only that, you know, even as we said, when people are within a few feet of each other, phones damage the quality of time we have together. Ever have a conversation with someone and all of a sudden they're looking down on their phone? I mean, if we were having a face-to-face conversation with someone and they walked away without saying anything and talked to somebody else, we'd say, well, that's rude. And yet, for some reason, it's okay when you're on a phone. And think about this. If a family member wanted to bring someone into your house, a parent would want to know, who is this person? Where are they from? How do you know them? And yet, ask yourself, who comes into your home virtually on your child's phone right in your very presence without any questions asked? You know, a survey done, because this is not just applying to kids, but it applies to parents. A survey done of kids of the age 6 to 12, 62% responded that their parents were often distracted. And the top reason, cell phones. Well, our second reason, our second harm, sleep deprivation. I'll just say one thing about this. There was an earnings call for Netflix, and the CEO was asked about their competitors. And one of the competitors that the Netflix CEO listed were competing with sleep. Okay, third harm, attention fragmentation. So do you know that all of the notifications that an average person gets who's on social media and maybe has a job or a school and normal kind of life is 192 notifications per day. That's about 1 every 5 minutes. That's for an average person. A heavy user, it can be up to 1 a minute. And so we've got this difficulty, don't we, with paying attention, staying on one task, one line of thinking, one mental road, because we're always triggered with an attractive off-ramp that calls. Someone could be saying something about you. Now, this last one, we're going to spend a little more time at, and that is addiction. The harm that social media has caused being addiction. You know, when the brain registers a good outcome, like achieving a goal, getting some food, relieving pain, or getting pleasure, a small amount of something called dopamine is released in the brain. It makes us feel good. But dopamine does not make us feel satisfied. It actually increases the want. And so you have one potato chip, and you want the second one even more. A gambler wins at a slot machine. He doesn't take his winnings and go home. No, he wants to win another one. So any behavioral addiction gambling, shopping, video games, whatever it is, chemical drugs, they're not all exactly the same process, but they all involve dopamine and craving. So there's a book written called Hooked: How to Build Habit-Forming Products. So we're going to look at the 4 steps that's outlined in this book and apply them to social media. The first one is a trigger. Okay, in social media, you get a notification. The next step is it requires an action to be performed. So the social media app says, tap here to open the notification. There is a variable reward. That is the pleasurable event, but it's variable. Only sometimes, because sometimes there's an expression of praise from a follower, maybe sometimes not. The point is, it's not rewarded every time. And then the last thing that really gets someone hooked is an investment. You put a little bit of yourself into the app. You fill out the profile. You post photos of yourself. You're linked with your families and friends. And so you then repeat again and again and again until the trigger at the top, it's no longer external, it's internal. I wonder if someone liked my post. I should check it without there even being a notification. But here's the thing about dopamine or any drug, but the brain gets used to it. And so then it needs an increased dosage to feel the pleasure. And so if you don't, you get a dopamine deficit, which then becomes unpleasurable. And then ordinary life just becomes boring and just plain painful without it. So on this topic of addiction, have a look at 4 quotes that I found to be actually shocking. So, first one, the smartphone is the modern day hypodermic needle delivering digital dopamine 24/7 for a wired generation. The next one is written by Sean Parker. Now, some of you may recognize that name. He was the founding president of Facebook. And he said during an interview in 2017, now he's become, interestingly, something of a conscientious objector, he says, when it comes to social media. But this is what he says. It notably interferes with productivity in weird ways. Who knows what it's doing to our children's brains? The thought process that went into building these apps, Facebook being the first of them, was all about how do we consume as much of your time and conscious attention as possible? And that means that we need to sort of give you a little dopamine hit every once in a while because someone liked or commented on a photo or a post or whatever. And that's going to get you to contribute more content. And that's going to get you more likes and comments. It's a social validation feedback loop. Exactly the kind of thing a hacker like myself would come up with because you're exploiting a vulnerability in human psychology. How about this next one by a man named Tristan Harris? He's a former ethicist at Google, left the company in 2015 and founded the Center for Humane Technology. He was called to testify in 2020 at a U.S. Senate Committee on Consumer Protection. And he says, in an attention economy, there's only so much attention. The advertising business model always wants more. So it becomes a race to the bottom of the brain cell. It starts small. First, to get your attention, I add slot machine, pull to refresh, rewards, which create little addictions. I remove stopping cues for infinite scrolling, so your mind forgets to do something. Then that's not enough. As attention gets more competitive, we have to crawl deeper down the brainstem to your identity and get you addicted to getting attention from other people. By adding the number of followers and likes, technology hacks our social validation, and now people are obsessed with the constant feedback they get from others. This helped fuel a mental health crisis for teenagers, he says. And lastly, an American statistician says there's only 2 industries that call their customers users: illegal drugs and software. Well, I forgot to do that. There we go. What do we find in the Bible? How's the Bible even able to give advice about a phenomena that appeared some 2,000 years after it was written? Well, we believe that the Bible has advice for every aspect of life. And we wonder how? Well, it's because it speaks to our very inner being, our motivation. It makes us examine our motives for doing something. It says it's sharper than a 2-edged sword at this. It pierces our soul and spirit and discerns the thoughts and intents of the heart. So, what advice do we find? For those of you or those who are on social media, why are you seeking followers? There's a word for follower in the Bible, and it's the word heretic. It means one who creates a faction or gains a following. And Paul says a man that's a heretic, you need to reject him. It's not to be put up with in the community of believers. How about the amount of time that you spend? Those who would spend all that time perfecting their online brand or consuming all those vast quantities. Well, Paul says in the context of whether it's good to have a wife or not, he says the time is short. It remains that they who have wives be as though they had none. Weep as though you did not. Rejoice as though they rejoice not. As those that use the world as not abusing it or overusing it. For the fashion of this world passes away. The time is short. He says, view your life as contracting all the time. And even the use of good things ought to be tempered. Don't indulge in wives and sorrow and joy in the things of this world, because the Greek language that's used, he says it's like the scene of a drama production. The scene is going to change. And the latest and greatest thing that comes on the stage, you'll find is now off the stage, and it's something new. And you've wasted your precious time. And what's more, you'll be spiritually unprepared. What about those who would seek likes? You're happy with all the likes that you get on your posts and your comments. Well, the Lord says this, I receive not honor from men, but I know you, that you have not the love of God in you. I'm come in my Father's name, and you receive me not. If another shall come in his own name, him you'll receive. How can you believe which receive honor one from another, and seek not the honor that cometh from God only? He also says later on in John, nevertheless, among the chief rulers also many believed on him, but because the Pharisees did not confess him, lest they should be put out of the synagogue. For they loved the praise of men more than the praise of God. What is the praise we're seeking on a social media platform? Well, There's another quote from Colossians, but I think we've made the point that comments about ourselves is not something that we're looking for. So if you're going to create a profile and post content, Colossians says that we're to do all things to the glory of God. Would any of you consider creating a profile and posting content to bring glory to God? To use it as a preaching tool, to show others, to show all your followers in the world that you believe on Him and confess Him? Or do you just love the praise of men more than the praise of God? Well, what about the point that it's an online profile? If it's online, then it's meant for others to see. And if your account is public, anybody can see it. But even if it's private, it's there for all of your friends to see. It's still meant to be a public display. Well, what does the Lord say in the Sermon on the Mount? Take heed that ye do not your alms before men to be seen of them. Otherwise, you've no reward of your Father in heaven. Therefore, when you doest thine alms, do not sound a trumpet before thee, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and the streets, that they may have the glory of men. I say unto you, they have the reward. When thou doest thine alms, let not thy left hand know what thy right hand doeth, that thine alms may be in secret, and thy Father which seeth in secret himself shall reward thee openly. What about the fact that social media is a wonderful conformity engine? Well, doesn't Paul directly address the danger of conforming to the world in Romans 12 in verse 2? Be not conformed to this world. Be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that ye may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. To be conformed means to fashion yourself according to the pattern of. To be transformed means literally to metamorphose into something else. And so we're to be changed by the renewing of our minds according to the Word of God. Lastly, addiction. Did you know that there is actually a Greek word for addiction that's widely used in the New Testament? Interestingly, it's the word proseko, which means to hold the mind towards, to pay attention to, apply yourself to. And it's used, as I said, widely, negatively. Do not apply yourself to false teaching, false men, fables, wine. And positively, to apply yourself, to be addicted to Paul's teaching, the flock, reading, to exhortation, to doctrine. And so are we enslaved to our master, the Lord Jesus Christ? Or are we enslaved to being unable to control our desires and so a slave to sin? Well, what do we have in Matthew chapter 18? Well, if we turn to Matthew 18, we're not going to say that we can glean from Matthew 18 that, well, this is how we protect ourselves. We need to set aside only certain times for use, or putting passwords in place, or putting software monitors on our devices. And maybe these have their places, but when it comes to the kind of social media that we're looking at, I think that Christ gives some pretty clear advice. He starts the chapter off by saying that we have to be as a child. The apostles were arguing over who's going to be the greatest. He says, be as a child who's not given to dominion, ambition, boasting, and glory, but they depend on their Father. They're teachable, they're mild, they're meek. And so he says, whatever offends you, whatever causes you to stumble or trips you up, and the word is literally where we get the English word for scandal from. Well, what's his advice? What do you do with a tool that's meant for self-promotion? It appeals to pride. It deprives us of our time and our sleep and fellowship, and it's designed to be addictive by its very nature. If this tool is affecting you in this way, Christ says, cut it off. He doesn't set aside certain times for it or password protect it. He says to cut it off. And I'll just maybe ask one other thing. Perhaps as a parent, you're wondering, at what age would you allow your son or daughter to have a phone? And well, I'm not going to suggest one, but I answer that question with a question. What age would you want to give them a device that can be turned into a modern day hypodermic dopamine needle if it wasn't properly used? So, ladies and gentlemen, I think that we need to give this topic some serious thought. And as Bible students, we need to consider why we're here on this earth, what we've been called to, and how we use our time, and how much certain activities and what we read and see can affect our minds, the mind that our God gave us to use to glorify Him.